I'd like to welcome all of you back to day 2 of our workshop for the Southwestern Public Service IRP stakeholder process. It's Tuesday and we're continuing our conversation from yesterday. I'm Margie Tatro with GridWorks, my colleagues Kathy Boyce and Deborah Shields you met, and we are so appreciative of all the stakeholders who are here both in the room in Roswell and those who are on Zoom in your various locations across the U.S. Thank you for being here. We have a special guest this morning that we're very honored to have Commissioner Greg Nybert here, who is serving on the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission, an important player in the whole scenario for stakeholder processes and IRPs. So with that, let me turn the microphone over to Commissioner Nybert to give his hello.
Thank you very much. You know, we're very pleased that all of you are here today to provide input. This process is very important to the Commission as we consider our utilities in the state, their expansion plans, their development plans, and also their energy mix. And this process is very important to us because we need to know what people around the state think. And so please give it your best effort and really let the folks know how you really feel about issues. I know that times are going to continue to be challenging, both with some of the restrictions that we find ourselves in New Mexico, and also the increasing cost of virtually everything. And people, when I walk down the street and they tell me, when is my utility bill going to go down? I keep telling them, I'm not sure that's going to happen because the costs just keep rising and rising. But this is an important process for us to try to maintain some semblance of order so the utilities can maintain some semblance of order in those challenging environments that they find themselves in, and frankly, the state finds itself in. So I just wanted to welcome you all. I'm on my way up to Albuquerque for a meeting at 1 o'clock with the commission, but thought I'd stop in on my way up to Albuquerque this morning. And we appreciate SPS and GridWorks coming to Roswell and having these meetings in Roswell. It means a lot to our community. And for those of you that were at Cattle Baron last night, I'm sure Cattle Baron appreciates the business that they received last night. So thank you very much. And I'll turn it over. And technically, I can't be here for the process, so I have to leave. But thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. And we're pleased to have other members of the staff from the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission involved in the process. As I mentioned yesterday, the PRC has 2 roles. There's an advisory role and then there's an advocacy role. And so we have utility division staff and we have staff from the advisory side of the commission involved as well. But as Commissioner Nybert said, those folks on the commission side, the advisory side, are technically observers to this process, whereas utility division staff are active in analysts and reporting and involved. So it's a little complicated, but they're doing a great job of helping out this process where they can and observing where they must. So with that, let me go on to our plan for today. Oh, this is not on. Thanks, Kathy. Today, we are going to continue our roundtable discussions. 2 different topics. Many of you had a chance, those in the room had a chance to talk about load forecasting, and you'll have a chance to talk about some other topics today. Those on Zoom, you had a great discussion, I think, on resources. So you'll get some opportunities to talk about load forecast and policy and planning requirements. So we'll have 2 rounds of roundtable discussions. As we did yesterday, you'll have subject matter experts in the room with you to ask and answer questions and have dialogue in a less formal kind of setting. We are capturing your thoughts and themes that come out of those so that that can inform our future workshops. So after that, we'll take a break. We'll ask for your reflections on what you've heard, what surprised you, where do you still have questions and want to learn more? That'll be after the final roundtable session. And then we have a presentation from SPS regarding how information sharing is going to take place, even in addition to these workshops. And so you'll hear more about that. We'll summarize, give a plug for the next workshop, and have adjourned by noon. So with that, let's go ahead and review. One thing we wanted to do is review from yesterday the things that we learned from you all in the QR code survey poll results that you and others in the Zoom room responded to. We asked you, what were your priority interests in this process? And you can see this is listed in priority order in terms of the number of people who indicated that interest. Industrial electrification was top of mind for 60% of our respondents. Grid affordability and customer bill impacts was second on the list. Grid reliability and rapid load growth. Then the three topics that came next were cost of new resources to meet demand growth, data centers and large load integration, and then the speed and timelines for serving new customers and supporting economic development. This will be included in our summary document from today's workshop, so you'll be able to see this information in more detail. But we will definitely be using this to prioritize topics that get discussed in our future workshops. So anyway, thank you for your responses to those who gave us input on that, and we'll be reporting as we go forward on progress on these conversations. So wanted you to hear that. And now our plan is to let you virtual participants on Zoom go into your discussion that Kathy will facilitate on Zoom. And those who are in the room here will be talking about planning requirements and policy requirements. So please grab a beverage and some breakfast if you haven't already. We're gonna group up together, probably in these two tables like we did yesterday, so we have a small conversation. And Zoom folks, you're ably facilitated by Kathy, who'll see you here shortly on Zoom. Any questions, Kathy? Anything we need to do? You're good. Okay. All right. Okay, let's get organized here. Let me turn this off because we're not going to be broadcasting Zoom here. So Jared, we'll let you and team introduce yourselves. Maybe pull up this flip chart while I get us reorganized. And we do have a
Screens in order. Okay, good morning, everybody, virtually. Can I just have a thumbs up or somebody let us know if you can hear us?
We can hear you.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, you're coming in really well. So we're in roundtable number 2 here virtually. So I have the load forecasting team. We'll take about 45 minutes here. They're going to walk through a discussion guide just for a few minutes. And then really it's time for you all to ask questions and get a chance to get a good foundation of the work that's ahead. So I'm going to ask the Excel team to introduce themselves in the room. And then we'll pull up the discussion guide and go from there.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is John Goodenough, Director of Sales, Energy, and Demand Forecasting. You'll be hearing from me a lot today, but also from the other folks in the room.
Travis Whalen, the Manager of Load Forecasting.
And Justin Gable, Director of Resource Planning.
Great.
Okay. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I will quickly go through the handout, the 2-pager for load forecasting. It's a lot of the material that I covered yesterday, so I don't want to spend a ton of time on that. I really would prefer to have a dialogue with most of the meeting time that we have here today. One of the things I wanted to make sure I highlighted, and Zoe touched on this as she was closing the meeting yesterday. If you look at the first kind of graph on the handout, it's our retail peak planning forecasts. And that dashed line, which is higher than the last IRP and the previous 2 RFPs, once you get a few years out, that's what our new forecast is going to look like. It won't be exactly those numbers as I explained yesterday, but it's going to have that type of growth in it. If you look at the numbers on the graph there, that means we're doubling the demand on the system within a decade. So one of the things I do want to spend some time today, hopefully, is getting the thoughts of the folks on Zoom about that, how that kind of lands with you and what your thoughts are on forecasting that much growth in the system. Aside from that, we talked about just the highly energy intensive and flat loads that we're bringing onto the system. We do have on the second page on the back of the handout, for those who have it in person, just the kind of the difference in the growth that we're forecasting in Texas versus New Mexico. The one thing I'll caveat here is, again, this is our existing 2025 V2 forecast. That'll look a little bit different when we formulate the 26 IRP, but significant growth in New Mexico, likely pushing it, within 5 years to being a higher contribution to peak demand in Texas. I think that will hold in the 26 V1 forecast. And the load's getting much, much flatter. We have winter peak demands expected to be above 90% of the summer peak demands within a decade. So obviously Justin's here. I'm sure he was, I assume he was asked about PRM yesterday, and that has implications, right? When your winter demand is that close to your summer peak demand on which loads are driving the resource needs and what type of resources you can add to meet those needs. I think I'll stop there unless there's any questions on the specific material in the handout, and turn it over to folks on the call for discussion.
So we'll invite folks virtually. If you have questions, maybe raise your hand virtually and we can just go one by one. It's on my screen, so.
I was just going to bring up the chat so that we can see it as it comes in.
Okay. Mark Walker, please. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, John. And I've been following this for a little while. Can you elaborate a little bit more on, I think one of the challenges we've seen in these cases, we've seen them in the CCN cases, and we'll probably continue to see them, are the casting of doubt on this load forecast. I think you did a good job explaining that in these cases. But I think it might be good to, if maybe just a little bit, talk about how you feel confident in the load forecast that you're talking about. 'Cause you're talking about some pretty big jumps here, but also I'll call it the elements of due diligence and conservatism, because I think that's real as well. And I think the more folks can hear about that, and so we don't have to get stuck in this fight about are your forecasts real or illusory. Tell us some more why you feel good about this. What have you done to sort of vet what you're basing these forecasts on, and and what elements of conservatism you've applied to it, if that makes sense.
It does, and thanks for the question. I think I'll touch on some of the conservatism that we apply to the forecast, and maybe let Travis talk some about the sustainability of the load. And yes, this was obviously a key topic in both of the CCN cases. So we do feel like this is an appropriate approach and a somewhat conservative approach to incorporating the load into the forecast. If you think back to one of the slides that I shared yesterday, which was the last one in the load forecasting section, which showed the magnitude of the total requests that we get versus what we're including in the forecast. We're including less than half. So we're not just taking any phone call from any customer for any demand and putting it into our load forecast. We're, seeing if it's been, we're including it if it's been studied and approved by SPP, obviously. We are including the load if it's pending approval by SPP due to some of the delays in providing those approvals, but we are confident that the load will, come to fruition once it is approved. And really in constant and regular communication with our oil and gas customers and our data center customers about their needs. So we are trying to be both realistic about the load that we can serve and the timeline we can serve it, while also recognizing just the incredible increase in demand from our customers and trying to serve those needs. Travis, if you want to share a little.
Yeah, I think if you want to kind of touch on some of the long-term sustainability of that load growth, I think one topic that I didn't mention in our kind of summary that came up is the specifically the sustainability of oil and gas load and of data center load as well. There's a handful of things to think about here when we're talking about these very, very long-term forecasts. The first is that if you are looking at a 30-year forecast, fundamentally you are not looking only at loads that are going to be contracted. There is no ESA for 2049. And if there is, you should fire that lawyer. That these have to reflect an amount of growth that is going to be on some level inherently speculative, because there is going to be a time frame beyond which you could plausibly have all of the documentation that you would have. So to some extent, we have to think about what is the potential beyond just what is absolutely known. Now, obviously we have this extremely sharp upward turn in our nearer term, if you're a 30-year forecaster, that sort of 5-year window, we see that huge spike, and that's driven very directly by requests that we have in hand, that if we had the capacity, we would serve in a matter of weeks and months. That's very substantial. And then the question is, how does that continue? How does that grow beyond that? And I think that there's a very real understanding within the oil and gas industry. One, that electrification of a lot of these processes, while it may not necessarily proceed at a stable rate for all companies for all years, is a general trend that is going to continue. There is demand for that. There's technologies available for it now, and that the overall average megawatts per kilowatts per barrel produced, that number is going to go up. That number was already not zero. Oil production had an electrical load to begin with, and that number is only going up. So as we go further out into our forecast timeframe, we have to expect that we're going to continue to see additional incremental growth, even above and beyond some of these discrete loads that John was talking about. Then you have to think about, okay, well, what about the sustainability of the industry? There have been questions said many times, how much do we want to invest in infrastructure to support this industry that EVs are going to make go away, or whatever other technological change is going to mean that this isn't going to be, part of the long-term future of New Mexico. There's a handful of, like, it's a very complex, very large topic, but I think that one of the most important things is that the Permian is one of the most productive and important basins in the world. I don't think that's in any way overstating it. It is a deeply nuanced, multi-layered formation that has an enormous amount of potential, has a lot of competitive activity, has a lot of structural advantages to it, and has shown enormous amount of growth as a result of that. So while we are thinking about growing our system, we have to consider that even in a world where, we're seeing oil demand being chipped away at by various other types of electrification and other changes in the economy, this is going to be one of the sort of strongest bets within that industry, and it's certainly one of the strongest bets for New Mexico. So we have to think about that as one of the more robust bets we could make as far as long-term industries.
So Travis, we have a couple folks with hands up and some more coming through the chat, but if I could put a finer point, because this came up in workshop number 1 as well, and I want to make sure that we're answering questions that are holdovers, but the criteria that SPS uses for including load into the retail load forecast. Can you kind of step us through those pieces?
Yeah, so we have our baseline growth, which I discussed, kind of the regression-based modeling based on population growth, economic growth. It's growing. It's a small portion of our overall increased need. We'll explain that a bit further once we have the forecast developed. But the criteria that we use to incorporate the new loads into the forecast, I've touched on this a bit, are approved loads by SPP, or loads that are delayed due to SPP studies, but will be approved once they get through that study process. Included in that are customers with signed ESAs, those sorts of things. The other portion of our planning load forecast is the probabilistic modeling. So there will be three kind of discrete growth drivers in our large loads in our planning forecast, which will be the oil and gas load, the contracted data center load, and then this, as yet unspecified amount of load growth that we expect to come either from existing requests that kind of move further in the stage gate process, get signed ESAs, move further in the SPP study process than what we're currently including, or future requests that we just don't know about yet. I mean, Travis, I think said it well. We're doing a 30-year forecast, and we have good insight in our customer needs for the next 5, maybe 7 years for some customers. So you get to 2035 and you're getting requests for 2040. We don't know what those are right now. So we're building in some growth for, the expectation that we continue to get those types of requests as well.
And so, John, I think you said something that you're looking for out of this process is some feedback from stakeholders of what kind of forecasts of those longer range needs would be helpful for SPS to do their forecasting.
Yeah, that's thanks for mentioning that, and I would solicit feedback from this group today or in future sessions on how we should define that as yet unspecified load. In the graph that you see on the handout, the way that we've split that unspecified load is we called it all oil and gas, and we've split it based on existing load growth in the underlying forecast between New Mexico and Texas. So that's a big part of the reason that you see the New Mexico share, increase dramatically once we start to add a lot of that additional oil and gas load. But however, we have significant requests from data centers. So to the extent we should be calling some of that as yet unspecified load growth data centers, or that people would want to see us define it that way, I think that's feedback that we're soliciting today.
Thank you. Okay, I see Mark and Charles and Kara in the chat. I am also going to pull down the discussion guide. You all should have that in your chat with a link. I'm going to pull up some notes so you can see what all we're recording in the room here. Mark, did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, a couple just quickly on these categories you talked about. You said the loads that have been approved by SPP and others that are, and then I got a little fuzzy, they're still under study or they're mainly held up because of maybe transmission has to get built or has to be studied. I recall that there's also this bucket of loads right now, and maybe that's getting sorted out at SPP, where SPP is not even studying it right now because of inadequate transmission and maybe resources. Where does that bucket fit in to these categories? And then lastly, on these sort of three general categories, what's the weight in, even in rough terms of this? Um, and you have, well, I guess we've parsed out different ways: oil and gas, data centers, unspecified, also stuff that's been studied, stuff to understudy, and then my other question there, and then this unspecified. So what is the weighting of these different buckets that y'all are looking at?
When you say weighting, do you mean the share of the total
Yeah,
load? Okay.
yeah. How much is the studied? How much is it, still in study? How much is it um, unspecified? Or I'm getting them mixed, muddled at this point. But I
No,
think there are different ways you stratify. But hey, I guess what I'm really interested in is of this unspecified amount. How big a piece is that? And I know that probably only matters further out, I'm assuming. But give us a
so
flavor of how that all fits together.
it starts to matter certainly within it does matter within the 5-year time. So we don't add any of it until 2028, the unspecified stuff. It gets to be meaningful amounts certainly within the 10-year time frame. It's the majority by the time you get to the end of the 30-year forecast, but that's sort of the name. So if you're not familiar with how these things are developed, it's based on a Monte Carlo simulation. So kind of the further out in time you go, the more error there is built into the models, which compounds every single year. The larger the share of going to the 85th percentile will be. So by the time you get to 2050, it's going to be the majority of the load. By the time you get to 2035, I think you're talking about roughly a third of it. I don't remember the exact numbers, but that should be in the ballpark. It starts out, you're talking about a few hundred megawatts to start. So like not small necessarily, but you will get up into gig and a half by the late 2030s. In the first several years of the forecast time frame, essentially all of the loads will be explicitly approved loads. Until you get to, because I think John mentioned, if not just now, yesterday, how we have sort of constraints built into our forecasting process where we'll only allow certain delayed loads to come in when those constraints are expected to be at least somewhat resolved or begin to become resolved. So that's going to mean some of the delayed loads starting to, and this would be the ones in that second bucket you mentioned, where they're undergoing SPP study. Like those will start coming into the picture in 2029 in Texas and 2031.
Yeah, I think 2031.
So in the new forecast, it would be 2031 in New Mexico, 2029 in Texas.
Thank you. And I do see several in the chat with hands up. We're coming to you. So let's start with Charles and then Kara will come to you next. Thank you.
Thanks. I've got a number of questions, and to start with, my initial questions are kind of similar to what Mark asked, and maybe I'll ask it a little bit more specifically. One thing that I'm curious about is of the three different categories here. I think it was data centers, the oil and gas, electrification of oil and gas, and unspecified. What is the relative percentage among those three different categories?
So again, that's going to vary by time, right? Because you have data centers coming on relatively soon and coming on at very high levels, especially in a planning forecast where we essentially have to reflect what we are contractually obligated to serve to those data centers. So you're going to see those come on, in 100 megawatt chunks. So it'll spike up really quickly, and so that at that point it's going to be a huge share of the relative load. But then because we're only including the a small handful of data centers and then not necessarily adding, at least not right now, not adding to that the probabilistic load, that share is going to decline dramatically throughout the forecast time frame. The one thing just to clarify is that unspecified load, right now, we are treating that as if it is oil and gas. We have talked about the possibility of treating it as if part of it is oil and gas and part of it is data centers. In theory, we could also treat it as if part of it is something else, but those seem like the most likely candidates for significant growth. So functionally, that unspecified load is also oil and gas load. It's just oil and gas load that's not tied to a specific project. But the share, by the time you get to 2035, data centers would.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I could just jump in with the 2035 share just to give. I think you're just looking for some numbers just so you can wrap your head around kind of the magnitude and the magnitude of these buckets that we're talking about. These won't be precise numbers. These won't be precise numbers. They'll be estimates.
That's fine.
As we finalize the forecast, we'll provide a lot more detail with more precision here, right? But we're doubling the system by 2035. System right now is about 4,500 megawatts. So think it adding 4,500 megawatts by 2035. About a third of that is unspecified. So, well, yet to be specified. It's coming from the probabilistic model. About 2 gigs of that is oil and gas, and about 1 gigawatt is data centers. So those are the 2 gigs for oil and gas and the one gigawatts for data centers. We'll be able to trace back and say, this is the project, this is the request, this is the capacity, this is the timeline that gives us that load. We'll be able to provide that much detail. The unspecified load, which is roughly a third of it, I think we're determining how we want to define that. Do we want to define that as oil and gas in Texas or New Mexico? Do we want to define some of that as data centers in Texas or
Okay, that's getting at what I'm trying to understand here. Then another question that I had is as far as the data centers are concerned, you have contracts with some of them. How firm is the data center load that you're projecting?
Yep, great question. So the ones that make it into that base, what's already being defined as data center load, will be ones with signed contracts.
Okay.
The ultimate impact of data centers depends on how much of the unspecified load we decide to call data centers, but the base data centers will only be ones that have signed agreements.
Okay, and then in the hearing that we had in January, I think the company presented a projection and analysis that was conducted by Mr. Oss. Is this the same analysis here that you're using for this projection, or is this something different?
Yeah, the work that Mr. Oss did, and Justin, tell me if I get this wrong, would have been based on the 24 RFP forecast, right?
Yeah, so that the information that Dan provided was related to the 24 B2 planning forecast, but it was really specific towards methane reductions out in the field related to oil and gas. So it was very specific, that information. John and Travis are really describing, the methodology for future forecasts that are much more encompassing, that encompass much more information than just oil and gas, and specifically much more inclusive than electrification of the oil and gas. So much broader topic today.
Okay, I think that's it.
Thank you, Charles. Good. We'll turn to Kara, and then Darren, you're next.
Morning, everyone. I'm gonna add a question in here, picking up on the questions that Charlie was just asking. Um, for the reductions in methane, I was wondering, will the oil and gas operators count those reductions in methane for any program? I'm thinking the Clean Transportation Fuel Standard in New Mexico, for example. Or
So,
will SPS count those, or will both entities count those?
Ms. Lynch, I think we might have to take your question back. What I would generally say though is that the methane analysis that was provided in the CCN was very specific towards, that forecast and, the discussion during the CCN. We haven't had a broader conversation, partially because we're still waiting on the approvals in that CCN and ultimately where that, that discussion ends. So at this time, I don't know if we got much more information that we could share about where methane reductions are ultimately captured, or where the distribution is between the utility and customers, or where that's at right now. So we may just have to take that back and bring more information later.
Okay, so the methane reductions possibly related to electrifying oil and gas in this forecast, those have not been, accounting for them has not been determined yet.
Well, the load forecasting activity is load forecasting. We're just
Correct.
forecasting load. We're not necessarily determining, a methane reduction related to that forecast yet. So we're still in the beginning stages of developing the forecast. That's much more of a later stage activity about methane reductions that are associated with that. And that methane reduction analysis really required additional information provided from customers, from their specific operations. That level of detail is not normally provided in developing the load forecast. And John,
Okay.
correct me if I'm wrong.
No,
with
that's
that.
absolutely correct. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
no,
here,
I do understand the limitations of the load forecast versus some of these actions that come afterwards. I have two more questions. My next question is, of the data centers that are knocking on SPS's door, do you know if those entities that own the data centers are looking to be served for the same load in other jurisdictions? Meaning, are they shopping both in SPS and elsewhere, or are they only shopping in SPS?
Great question. I think this will, to some extent go into the follow-up section here. And, through the discussion yesterday and this discussion, I think it's important to get someone from our economic development team, in a future meeting to, who's in conversations with those data center customers and whatnot to better address that. Right? They're the ones having the conversations. I guess what I will say though, is that, as I mentioned earlier, the ones that will carve out specifically as data center loads will be, they're under construction in our service territory and have ESAs. So fairly confident, as confident as you can be, that load will show up in our service territory. And, I mentioned earlier that we have roughly 1.5 gigawatts of this unspecified load that we seek to understand how to split out between data centers and oil and gas. We have multiple gigawatts of other data center load under discussion. So even if some of those are shopping around, some of them likely are, to the extent we split some of that 1,500 in a data center load, it's not going to be all of the other requests we've gotten. It'll be a small portion of the requests that we've gotten. And we'll want to make sure that we feel confident about that as well.
Okay. And then do you know whether, yes.
Were you changing topic? Because I do have one other thing I want to note on that.
It's the same topic, and go ahead.
So the other thing that I want to say about the idea of shopping around is that, and I understand obviously why people are concerned about that. it's worth noting that even a customer that is actively pursuing essentially identical projects across multiple territories does not necessarily mean that they're looking for the best one. I mean, we've seen this actually fairly directly, where a customer might be looking at 12 different locations, and it's not like they pick one and then they are done. You know, there is an enormous need for incremental data center capacity, and that's going to mean continuing development of multiple projects across essentially every single customer. And there's going to be kind of a continuing jockeying between numerous different projects, and many of them are going to end up getting built. So when you have multiple projects being sort of shopped, so to speak, that you could very plausibly see, 4 out of 12 getting built. And yes, you don't know whether or not yours are going to be in them, but that's why you take a conservative approach of waiting for a contract. But it is not as simple as, this one project is being multiplied by 12, and that it's going to be a fraction of what it is. It might be that over the course of 30 years, all 12 of them get built. Because those end up being, the best projects, and we're looking at worse projects, 10, 15 years from now.
Two more questions. I just want to throw them out there, and then I'm done with asking you questions, I think, because I could go on and on. One question is related to your knowledge of the data centers that are being built. Are they sector specific, or are they general in their services that will be provided? Do you understand that question? Meaning, are these data centers meant for tasks that would be used in the oil and gas sector only? Or are they going to be data centers for general use that extends to Austin and Dallas and Albuquerque? And then my second question is probably one that may get deferred because it's related to rates and allocation of costs. But if the load growth that's being forecasted is because of industry, for example, data centers and oil and gas, are those industries receiving the costs associated with that growth, or are those being socialized?
Yeah, let me maybe touch briefly on your first question, and then commit to providing more detail to the extent we can in a future conversation. To my understanding, the data center load won't be geared toward a specific industry. It will be more kind of broad economic use. And then for your second question about the allocation of the cost, you're right. We're gonna kick that to a follow up. The company does intend to file a large load tariff. I think Zoe said this first half of this year, right?
Yeah, that's target.
So that's coming up, and she can share more on that, I'm sure. Or you'll hear a lot more about that as we kind of go through that proceeding, that filing and proceeding.
I wondered, Kara, before we leave you, I know you had questions on methane specifically, but generally the emissions analysis. Where in the point of this resource planning process will stakeholders see emissions, carbon, methane? When or how might they expect to see that?
Yeah, the carbon emissions related to the portfolio that isn't encompass output. I mean, so there are some discrete emissions that are reported as a part of that. It's a projection, like there's some assumptions there about technology types. There are or emissions that are related to that. So that is something generally that we model and we will have available in Encompass output files.
That is specifically to your portfolio, not necessarily to the electrification happening
Correct.
within the load
Right.
itself.
Right.
Correct. It's specific to the utility side resources. It's not necessarily geared towards a methane reduction for customer loads. That was a very discrete analysis performed by an external party with input from customers through survey. So I don't know that we're looking at this moment at the addition of that same type of methane analysis specifically, but a general emissions profile of resources available for the different portfolios is a general output we provide.
Thank you. Kara, I think we're gonna keep going unless you have something else.
No, thank you for that follow-up.
Okay, thank you. Darren, thank you for your patience.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was wondering if you guys could help me understand better the business case for the oil and gas folks. John, I think in our resource case in January, and unfortunately we didn't have enough time to delve deeper into certain issues, but you had mentioned that the data center growth is largely in Texas, and that the oil and gas growth, electricity growth, is largely in New Mexico and not in Texas, which I found was interesting. And I had hypothesized that a lot of our, you know, New Mexico Environment Department rules and clean energy goals are driving a lot of that electrification in New Mexico. So it kind of drives back to a policy driver in the state as being the true driver of electrification in the oil and gas sector, and that the actual economics or the business case has not fundamentally changed in the last 100 years. That, you know, maybe it makes sense to electrify my collection facilities, you know, with electrified valves and, you know, actuators and stuff, just because of you know, it helps me with compliance. But you know, that's kilowatts, that's not megawatts. I'm assuming your megawatts are mainly compressor stations that are looking to electrify to get out of the engine emission requirements that NMED has set up. And that, you know, if that policy changed, would that continue into the future? Because why, as an oil and gas industry, would I sell you folks gas to burn at gains to sell me back electricity so that I can run that same compressor that I was direct driving with a gas-fired unit? So I guess that's right. So there, I got it one. So a couple of questions. The first question really is that immediate growth in New Mexico partly due to that wholesale customer switching over to retail? And then that whole other question about the business case for the oil and gas sector. Are we sure, if policy doesn't change in New Mexico, that will still hold true, or does that have the risk of going back to the way it's been?
I'll address the first question, and then maybe let Travis weigh in on the second one. So no, we're not including a wholesale customer switching to retail in our load forecast. So the path of growth that you see in the red dashed line on, you know, in the existing forecast is really driven by the demand and the constraints. So you see you know, growth of approved loads for the next few years, and then as the constraints start to get relieved, you start to see the rapid addition of loads that are kind of waiting for those constraints to be relieved. One of the things that we talked about in the room yesterday, and you know, I'll share it for the group here. This kind of slower growth in the near term, and then once you get a few years out, rapid growth, it's not reflective of customer demand. It is those constraints to serve that load that are driving that delay. So this is actually what we call our constrained forecast, our constrained planning forecast. We also produce an unconstrained planning forecast, which just starts growing right away, right? Because we have a ton of demand, a ton of customers waiting to connect. So in the presentation of the IRP, I think we could show both and kind of explain, the magnitude of the constraint, like the impact of the constraints and magnitude of megawatt hours, those kinds of things. And Travis, if you want to weigh in on the second question.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple things. The extent to which compliance is driving electrification and driving some of the increase in demand, I don't think we have firm numbers on that. And for the same reason that it's kind of difficult to do the analysis that Justin was talking about earlier, is that you have to dig into the details of every single customer and what they would have done with and without those. One thing that's worth noting is that a significant percentage of our load was oil and gas before those. That there is a load component to oil and gas exploration and an increasing desire for that load component to be grid connected, independent of compliance, simply because there's more opportunities for that to happen as the region gets built out, and as that becomes possible, rather than the understanding that you're just going to have a generator. You're not realistically going to get grid connected. So while we are seeing an increase in the sort of kW per barrel requirement, that kW per barrel was never zero. And a large part of what has driven the growth over the past 10 years is not just the electrification, it's the fact that the oil and gas industry within our service territory specifically has grown. The New Mexico portion of the Permian Basin was the later developed and saw the much greater growth trajectory over the past decade relative to Texas, and we're seeing the consequences of that. Now, could we see a change in the direction of the sort of kW per barrel requirements? Yeah, I mean, obviously that's always possible. However, there is a certain degree of momentum to technology changes. As more and more companies have invested in technology and in electrifying these processes. One, the technologies are just more available. That there is equipment available now that was not available realistically 10, 15 years ago. And as a result, some companies will choose to invest in that, even if it is not part of the requirement. And part of whether or not they choose to do so is going to be based on what is the relative costs of both the technology and the equipment itself, and then our service to get there. So as we're able to be able to provide affordable service and provide timely service, it's going to incentivize further growth. So our ability to serve customers quickly will then only increase the kind of impetus for that growing electrification, that growing change.
But your kW per barrel is higher in New Mexico than in Texas?
I mean, in Texas, oil and gas, we don't serve the Permian in Texas, not meaningfully. We serve sort of the outer edges of it. The core of Permian development is outside of our Texas service territory. Our Texas service territory is primarily in Amarillo, up in the Panhandle. So again, there is oil and gas there, and there are particularly some older legacy fields, but it's just not part of a big growth area.
Okay.
And so we aren't seeing growing oil and gas loads.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Okay, I think, Michael, you've got your hand up. We'll come to you in just a minute. We are going to conclude this roundtable in just a few minutes at 9:30 Mountain Time. And I do have a couple questions I want to give to the SPS team to make sure they share with you all before we conclude. So, Michael, why don't you go ahead and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Yes, I'll be quick. I just wanted to speak to the last comment by Darren. Basically, in the oil and gas industry, I mean, the main goal is to reduce our carbon intensity. And we're trying to electrify in both Texas and New Mexico, I would say, and at the same levels. And so that's just an important, part of our industry. And also, I mean, electrifying equipment is more efficient. It's less maintenance. We definitely prefer electrical, equipment over gas driven. And then Darren did mention, why would we want, gas powered, turbines for power from a utility perspective? And I think that's mainly because we see such a great, increase in baseload demand, and we realize that you have to have dispatchable power. You can't run a grid efficiently based on current technologies with just renewables. And so that'd be my comment there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Okay, so our group next door in person is ready to shift. Before we do, I just want to emphasize, we heard from the team today that the load forecast that you are seeing is not finalized. This is still in analysis stage. So to the team here, when can the stakeholders expect to see a final numbers for the load forecast?
Yeah, so the forecast it's pretty in flight right now. Where it's being developed. Our target with our current, plan on how to build that forecast is to deliver that to Justin's team by the end of the month. But what I will say is please provide feedback on what you've heard during this, during the presentation yesterday and during this discussion, because if we get significant feedback, we will seek to incorporate it or address it at least, as, recognizing that it's important to stakeholders, and we can still bring it into the forecast, right? Like, we're targeting the end of the month. If we get significant input that we decide to bring into the base planning forecast, then we can delay that delivery a little bit. But also be thinking about scenarios. Maybe everybody's like, okay, that kind of makes sense for your base forecast. What scenarios would you like to see? And typically we run what we call a financial forecast as a low scenario, or at least a lower growth conservative scenario. I mentioned the unconstrained planning forecast. That could be an interesting scenario to see. Just what the growth would look like without putting these kind of resource and transmission constraints in it. And we talk a lot about oil and gas load. Obviously, it's extremely important. As I mentioned, we do have multiple gigawatts of data center requests out there. So to me, an interesting high case would be put another gigawatt of data center load in Texas, or put another gigawatt of data center load in New Mexico, and just see what it does to the planning process, or to the, Justin's model. So I'm throwing those out there as kind of examples of scenarios that I think would be informative. Definitely provide feedback if you think that those are good ideas, or if you have other ideas that you'd like to see.
So stakeholder requests for modeling runs will be a pretty significant part of our work coming in the next few workshops. So we will return to that and help give you some structure of how you can provide that input, or how you might react to what SPS is already doing in their base case, and where you might want to see some alterations. John, before we leave it, when you say you're seeking feedback specifically to load forecast, is there a question that you could leave stakeholders that you would love for them to answer for you?
Well, I think there's two, and we've talked about them. One is what I just spoke through. What scenarios would stakeholders be interested in seeing? I will note that there was a lot of talk about the electrification scenario from the last IRP in the CCN hearings. That scenario came about through this stakeholder process. It was the stakeholder feedback that led to that electrification scenario. So very valuable, and we do take that into consideration. And then the other is, to the extent that we have unspecified growth that we're not going to tie back to specific projects, is there an interest in seeing some of that be data center, just given the scale of the requests that we have? Aside from the scenarios that I mentioned where we put a gigawatt in one or the other state.
If I may tag on just a little bit,
Is it?
Introduce yourself just so can folks see Justin all right?
You do.
You did, okay.
Yeah. So just to add on to John's comment here about these different sensitivities for load forecast, the value here is to understand what the resource buildouts would look like to address these different discrete scenarios. So we can see the differential buildouts required. The data center between Texas and New Mexico is a really good component to be thinking about. Is how does it look for New Mexico customers with an RPS requirement to be able to solution out a 1 gigawatt data center? And we can see the difference between that and what the base scenario is to understand exactly what both the cost differences on a net present value basis, but also what is just the actual resource types that are needed to be able to solution that, and what volumes those resources are needed at to both meet the demand and comply with New Mexico state specific goals. So things that we would love for you guys to think about and provide some feedback on. And we're asking for, the outside input here, partly because we think that we've got some good grasp on it, but we believe that the community has an ability to provide even more creative ideas than what we're presenting here.
Okay, with that, we're going to shift to our third roundtable. This group, you're going to be moving on to planning and policy requirements. So that's a different team. We'll just thank John, Travis, and Justin for joining us today. Give us just 2 minutes as we shift rooms, and we'll be back online with you shortly. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we're back. Thank you for joining us. So we have some new faces in front of the camera here. This is the planning and policy requirements roundtable. So you have what's on your screen is a discussion guide. I will drop it into the chat for you. I'm going to have the team introduce themselves. They'll walk through the discussion guide for just a few minutes, and then we'll go right into questions. So please, as they're talking it through, jot some notes to yourself on what you would like to come back to during the discussion. So with that, I'll ask the team to introduce themselves, please.
All right, good morning. Jared Cooley, Senior Director of Strategic Planning for SPS.
And I'm Linda Hudgens. I am an SPS Regulatory Policy Specialist.
Good morning. I'm Sam Eisenberg. I'm outside counsel for SPS.
So in front of you, or virtually on the screen, or if you have any printed out handouts, we put together a little 2-pager to talk a little bit about the Southwest Power Pool and some of our state policy considerations that we SPS have to navigate with our Texas-New Mexico split. Just going over a couple of high-level things on this map, or on this document, wanted to highlight on this map is that where one SPS is physically located in the Southwest Power Pool, really on that southwest corner, really at the bottom. South of us is ERCOT, where we have no connections to, and then to the west, we have three HVDC ties connecting SPS to the western, but we have very little connectivity. And so this map also shows a little bit about how the Southwest Power Pool is expanding in the RTO West. But wanted to again highlight that there's really not a lot changing with the RTO expansion reflected to where SPS is situated. In this document, also highlighted a few topics that I went over yesterday about the DICES, about the ARIS project, about consolidated planning process, Hills and Hilga. So there's a little bit of a background information in here. We can talk more in depth on some of these topics if questions come up. The bottom left, this is the map that I did talk about yesterday in the presentation as well, is really highlighting some of the really 345 and 765 kV transmission infrastructure that's been identified in the SPS footprint. Whether assigned to SPS or have gone out for competitive bidding, these projects will have significant reliability and market benefits to SPS customers. These are just really the highest voltage projects. There are a lot more localized, lower voltage projects that are also been identified in the footprint to support load growth. The next page is just really providing a table of some of the changes in plan and reserve margin requirements as they move forward over the next handful of years. These values are approved by the Regional State Committee at the Southwest Power Pool, which is comprised of commissioners from every state in the Southwest Power Pool region. And so really just want to put those numbers out there. This really ties a lot into what Justin Gable and his team are solutioning for in RFPs, but it does start with the Southwest Power Pool. And then Linda's going to talk a little bit about some of the state policy items that we identified in this document.
Yes, thank you. So as most of you know, we do cross two states that have quite differing policies. I've added to the sheet here the upcoming renewable energy percentages that must be met under the New Mexico Renewable Energy Act, which was updated a few years ago by the Energy Transition Act legislation. And you'll see that those percentages of New Mexico retail sales that must be served by renewable energy jump up to 50% in 2030, 80% in 2040. And then in 2045, we switch from that percentage of renewable energy to a zero carbon standard that we must meet. Texas used to have a renewable energy percentage requirement. They've reached the point where they have sunsetted that requirement. They're to the point where they believe that the supply and demand has made that renewable energy more affordable to where it can become a naturally, organically growing portion of the system. As we do plan our system, of course, most of you know we plan it as one entire system. So we do have to look at modeling as an entire system under the cost-effective resources, and then step back and look at whether we can meet those Renewable Energy Act standards with those projects that were selected. And if not, then we have to look at bringing on projects that are the next step above in cost that are renewable that we would need to bring in to meet the Renewable Energy Act standards. I'm sure that you have already heard some of this from Justin Gable as he talks forecasting. I'm sorry, as he talks planning and how his group does the modeling. But we do have to consider those state policies as we bring in the new technology and such. So I think we'll jump into questions.
Yeah, okay, so we'll stop there. I'm going to stop sharing. You all have it in the chat if you want to go back to the discussion guide. And we'll just open the floor here similarly to what we did previously. Raise your virtual hand if you have a question and open it up to folks to better understand some of the planning and policy requirements. Kara.
Hi again. I was wondering about the Texas bill that passed related to curtailing of data center loads when there's an event, an extreme event. And whether those get considered or will be considered for the PRM? That's my question.
Do you have any background on that Texas bill?
I do not.
Okay.
But I do wonder if it is ERCOT specific.
Okay. So Kara, I don't have any specific background on that Texas bill you're referring to, and we can look into that, whether it's an ERCOT specific, but I think your general premise though is about how will large loads be treated and how should they be treated with planning reserve margin requirements. I think that can be a more broader issue that it does fit into the SPS area. So when we think about the SPS system and how we treat our loads, if we're serving a load with firm service requirements, we are required to bring the necessary load to serve that, and that load gets factored into our planning reserve margin percentages, and then we must procure those resources to serve that. And so the Southwest Power Pool is creating some sort of new concepts around what is called the chills concept. I didn't incorporate it here, but it was in the slide deck from yesterday, where that would be a curtailable load that during situations where the system does not have enough resources to serve all the firm service loads, those would be the first loads off the system. So they could be on the system a lot of the time, but not all the time, like we typically treat firm service customers that are only shed in emergency situations. And so there's also concepts around PALs, which is price adaptive loads. And so again, I don't think price adaptive loads really fits the data center concepts, but the Southwest Power Pool is looking at some sort of different ideas around being able to add large loads or loads in general, but then putting some of these different provisions on there that aren't locking you into that firm service requirement where we then have to have enough resources to fully serve you. But our current policy is today, if you're a data center and we've connected you and we've agreed to serve, let's say 200 megawatts, we plan that 200 megawatts within as 200 megawatts of firm service, we plan it into our LNR tables.
Okay, that makes sense. And I hear that there may be opportunity for us to engage in ongoing conversation about, the actual loads that get included in the PRM. What I hear you say right now is that any entity that you serve is included. And if certain entities will be included in curtailment, then that would seem to reduce the PRM. And considering SPP's expectations, from my perspective, it's a good thing to reduce that PRM. So I look forward to ongoing conversation.
Thanks, Kara. One thing I'll add in there is just the fact that with data centers in particular and the kind of the balance between some of them bringing their own generation, that also could reduce the amount of load that we're being asked to actually serve. So, again, there's the HILGA concept with Southwest Power Pool, there's behind the meter, there's chills concepts, there's quite a few different aspects that are in play, as well as how we honestly develop our large load tariff. That there's some of those nuances that probably can be flushed out a little bit further along the way, and how will those specifically play into our load portion of our load and resource tables.
Great, thank you.
And I think I might clarify that really all of those considerations don't change the PRM per se, that those percentages are still there, but it would affect the level of the load forecast upon that PRM is layered on.
Yeah. At the end of the day, though, if it's our load that we're serving and we're contractually obligated to serve them, we're going to want that in and then have a PRM associated with that if it's going to be on, because that is how we maintain system reliability.
Thanks, Kara. Other folks have questions on some of the SPP policies, planning reserve margins, renewable portfolio standards for New Mexico? Mark, please go ahead.
Morning, Mark.
Hey there. Hey, Jared and Linda. Good to see y'all. Well, since no one else was asking a question, you touched on this a little bit yesterday, I think, on these other options that SPP has put out there, the ARIS and some of these other items, in particular, ARIS. Can you tell us, and really all of them, just maybe in summation, what SPS is doing to take advantage of those options to get resources on board more quickly?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So, and specifically around resources, historically, as I talked about yesterday, the DICEs for new generation interconnection, replacement, and surplus concepts we have been utilizing in our RFPs to help get new generation online. The Southwest Power Pool in the last year has built two new processes, one called ARIS. It's in the one pager. It's a one-time fast track generation interconnection process that allows those entities that have load serving challenges with the amount of load that they have on in their forecasts to enter in some generators to move through very quickly through the study process. And then there's also a concept called priority processing, which was taking existing points of interconnection on the system and incrementing the amount of interconnection service by 20% at those locations. To touch on ARIS, I'll say that ARIS was one of the avenues that was identified in the 2025 RFP as a process, as a type of resource or resource process that could be entered into that RFP for solutioning. And I'll say broadly, if you check the SPP queue that's publicly available, you'll see that there are a number of projects in the SPS region that were identified as ARIS projects. I don't want to go too much into that because about exactly who submitted them, but I will say that ARIS projects could only be submitted by a load responsible entity. So it's broadly, it's safe to say that a lot of the ARIS projects that are in the SPS footprint were submitted by SPS. And those will be solutioned through the RFP as we treat all resources during that modeling and review period. And in regards to priority processing, this is a standalone process where we could just increment the injection capabilities at existing generators. We are looking into this. This is a very short window, though. The Southwest Power Pool is looking to close this by, I think, July of 2026. And so it's really only being open for about 9 months. And so we are looking at what locations do we already have assets in place that we could add to those existing points to increase their injection. What that would do is it would just allow us a really quick path for getting more accredited capacity at those locations, more nameplate, and then without having to go out and do a surplus, a replacement, or a new generation interconnection. So we are investigating both processes. We see a lot of value with the low cost because both of these should have lower cost or no cost for transmission, and they should be faster.
Thank you, Mark. Other folks thinking about transmission development, transmission plans? I will offer, maybe bring back something from workshop 1 that I think maybe went on. Mark, I'll get to you in just a minute. SPS will need to renew its participation in the Southwest Power Pool during this, I believe it was even the action plan, right? In the next 3 years. Do I have that correctly?
Sorry.
Go ahead, yeah. We are due to provide a study by mid 2028. It's kind of a cost benefit of SPP participation. That's what you're referring to.
Yes. And I think there was a question from workshop 1. In the scenario development around the resource planning, will SPS consider a scenario all of them in SPP, and then one that would be not participating in the SPP? Will you all plan to do a scenario?
Just to touched on that a little bit. We will continue to work toward that summer of 2028 filing. Definitely is an important topic that's come up in the CCN filings about the participation with the Southwest Power Pool. When we look at how we do some of our modeling, we do run some scenarios where we do markets off, which then really relies upon the existing generation within the SPS area. And so if we can continue to do those type of scenarios, possibly as part of the IRP process. To take it the next step further, though, of actually modeling leaving the Southwest Power Pool, there's a lot more of items that would then have to be factored in. Items about costs for now managing our own tariffs, costs around point-to-point transmission to move energy or to get energy from other neighboring utilities, the getting transmission for generation assets that are not physically located in our footprint, and then also the exit fee from the Southwest Power Pool itself. That is no, I don't think anybody has ever left the Southwest Power Pool since they've enforced a exit fee associated with that, and so that would be quite expensive, and that's something we can dig into and figure out, if needed be, how would we want to factor that into. That exit fee is really tied to transmission and the fact that SPS, as a member of the Southwest Power Pool, pays a portion of all transmission projects that are developed in the planning processes. And so projects in the SPS area are cost allocated, and so we pay a portion and the rest of the region pays a portion depending on the voltage. And so to exit, we would have to make up those costs that we would have been paying to the other entities, but would no longer be paying once we leave. And so that can be could be very expensive, and it's something that we'll investigate, and definitely something that we would have to bring forth as part of that summer 2028 filing. So a number of aspects we would need to factor in if we want to go down that route of how much do we want to truly deep dive into a leaving SPP scenario.
Yeah, Jared, if I could jump in for a second, I think it'd be really helpful to hear from stakeholders in terms of that scenario. What is it within the context of the IRP itself? What are stakeholders looking for? Is the question the one that I think we focused most closely on in the CCN cases? What would the planning reserve margin be for a system that is no longer part of the RTO? Is it looking at all the costs? Is it looking at modeling which potential resources you might build or not build depending on your connectivity to other regions and how the balancing authority needs to act if it's outside the RTO? There's a lot of layers of this. I don't know that you can build one model that will cover all of those, but having some specifics from stakeholders as to what particular points of interest you want to see in the IRP would be helpful, keeping in mind that the RFP will have a relatively shorter window that we're looking at for actual resources that we're going to build, and is not, the RFP is not planning the resources that will be built over time for the next 30 years. Say, like the decision to leave SPP or not is a longer term decision, and so any input you all have would be very helpful at that point.
So we'll open it to stakeholders of SPP participation and a potential exit. If you could give us some insights of what is it particularly that you were inquiring about. And this is a holdover from workshop 1. So short of me calling on specific individuals, I'll just give a minute to see if there are thoughts.
I do have some thoughts. I also am aware of taking up a whole lot of space and time. So if there are other stakeholders that want to jump in, please let me know.
Yeah, nope, that I am monitoring that, Kara. I appreciate you being conscious of airtime, and please go ahead.
Okay. So I have 2 questions related to this issue. Am I accurate in remembering that one of the proposals for a transmission line in the most recent CCN application was to connect SPS to SPP. I mean, to further provide supply energy to SPP.
Yeah, Kara. So when I'm thinking back on the two CCN cases in Texas and New Mexico, the main transmission project that we identified was the 345 kV lines around Gaines County, which is fully within the SPS service territory. There was at one point was it a capacitor bank or something that was identified as a transmission solution that was identified by the Southwest Power Pool at the time of the filing as needed to support Gaines County. But by the time we got to the hearings, SPP had updated their study work, and there was no other transmission facilities outside of the 345 kV lines from Hobbs to Andrews to Roadrunner, which is really located in our South Texas and New Mexico area, to serve generation in that CCN case. So for the Gen CCN case, that's the only transmission project that we moved forward with, and that's fully within SPS.
Okay. And so I heard that there's an exit fee associated with exiting from SPP. Would it also potentially mean that there would be stranded assets associated with that exit? So there'd be an exit fee and then continuation of ratepayers needing to pay for the transmission that was used for the SPP system?
So I specifically on that concept, I would find that there are no transmission assets currently on the SPS system that are not used and useful to benefit customers. But as I said before, we would have to make some of the other utilities. We'd have to cover some of the costs that SPS had been previously allocated as part of our load ratio shares to cover their transmission projects in other parts of the region. And so we would have to pay for our share of those. And those wouldn't be used and useful for SPS if we were disconnected from the rest of the SPP. So
okay, great.
kind of that definition of I just
yeah.
want to be clear, stranded assets in our service territory, I don't think would be accurate, but we would have to pay other people for us leaving. And then we also have to
pay.
Yeah, we'd have to pay something. Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
And then we'd have to figure out, what do we want to do next? Do we stand up our own RTO? Do we stand up our own balancing authority? Do we go find another RTO to join, which based off our physical location will be extremely difficult. So there's a lot of those aspects that we had been not just leaving, but then what do we do next is also part of that conversation with the idea around exiting SPP.
Yeah, and I think, I think stakeholders are just, or at least from my perspective, concerned about SPPs increasing the PRM requirements. And so, maybe the conversation is more focused on the power SPS has to help determine those, or limit the extent that SPP requests PRM or whatever from SPS, because I understand that they're two very important working entities, SPP and SPS, and I don't know that exiting is the necessary strategy moving forward. Maybe other stakeholders want to jump in. Just making sure we hit on the right point for moving the conversation forward.
Thanks, Kara.
Jared, Linda, do you want to elaborate maybe a bit on particularly the planning reserve margin? I think the numbers there, given what we have seen historically in New Mexico, the planning reserve requirement is shocking. And I have heard you all repeatedly say it is a requirement of SPP participation. We have to do this. We don't have a choice. So can you kind of walk us through where did it come from? Why is the winter particularly so high? What role did SPS have in any of the decision making on the planning reserve requirement?
Yeah, so to provide some background, I'll try to be brief on a topic that is anything but brief. But the planning reserve margin at the Southwest Power Pool has really started with the loss of load expectation study performed by SPP staff. And this takes into account loads and resources that are both existing and forecasted, but it also does a back look at how the system has experienced different weather events over the years and takes a historical look as well. So Winter Storm Uri, a lot of this has really come out of what has happened after Winter Storm Uri. And that's really where the development of even a winter PRM was really pushed. Is where kind of the Southwest Power Pool has really been pushing to see increases in reserve margin due to the desire to avoid any of these extreme weather events and load sheds that we saw in the past. And so it really starts with the loss of load expectation study. That is then talked about at some of the working groups, primarily the supply adequacy working group that Justin Gable, who you just heard from a little bit ago, he's the SPS representative on. And then that goes up into the higher stakeholder groups. But eventually, the group that actually approves the planning reserve margin is the group called the Regional State Committee, which is comprised of all the commissioners from the states of the SPP. And so stakeholders weigh in, staff has their own recommendations. What we've seen over the years is that staff and stakeholders have disagreed on what the values should be. There's been a disconnect where going back to the development of the winter 2026-2027 value, stakeholders advocated for a 33% winter PRM based off of what they saw in the study results. SPP staff argued for 36%. Ultimately, 36% was what was approved by the commissioners on the Regional State Committee, and that's what was then our affected value now going forward. We've been pushing for some policy changes around what is the methodology, as well as providing a lot more forward-looking values on these planning reserve margins. So the establishment of a 2029 planning reserve margin is something that SPS had advocated very strongly for. You cannot give us 1 or 2 years to meet these changes. We need a glide path of 4+ years in order to meet that value. So it's been changes to methodologies. Now SPP is running the loss of load expectation studies annually instead of every other year. They're doing a 4-year look and a 6-year look. And then they redo the 6-year look 2 years later to do the 4-year look. And so there's been a lot of changes in the last 3 years on how our planning reserve margin studies performed, the cadences. But at the end of the day, it is up to the Regional State Committee to determine what is that value that we are then required to bill to. And if we don't meet it, we are then subject to deficiency payments.
And we might add that if we were not part of the SPP, we would still need a planning reserve margin, whether it was self-imposed or if we joined another RTO.
Yep.
We would still have these requirements if we want to have a reliable system. It's just necessary.
Oh, we need to dance just a minute. Darren, please go ahead.
Sorry about that.
We didn't lose power.
To our seats here, yeah. Darren, please go ahead.
Good morning, Darren.
Yeah, thanks. I had to step away there, so I'm kind of coming in halfway. Yeah, I just wanted to express, so it's out there, the concerns, because, it's very easy for a market, an RTO, to say, here's the planning reserve margin, because all of those costs aren't shared by them. it's all driven down to the customers of SPS, the captive customers. And so anytime they change that planning reserve number, it costs the customers, the ratepayers, billions in this case. And that's the concern, is that you have this multi-state market that, in a potentially to shield their cost fluctuations on the energy side, mandate all this excess capacity, which they don't see because they don't have a capacity market per se. So it drives it all down to the customers of the captive utilities, basically. And so that's where our whole concern about, is this really worthwhile to, is this in the best interest of the customers? Because we don't really have, I mean, we have one vote, one state vote in a larger process, but we really don't have much control over what that mandate is coming down from this quasi-governmental entity. And then it's not just the planning reserve margin, it's also the ELCC, which we find is there's not a national standard, and we're not quite clear as to how that's being calculated because it's vastly different than what we're seeing with, say, PNM. And it's very non-friendly to the only state in SPP's footprint that has 100% zero carbon goal. And so again, is SPP working positively for the consumer in New Mexico? Or is it putting a big weight on our ability to move forward? And that's kind of the fundamental concern here with the staff.
Appreciate those insights, Darren. I'm not sure when you stepped away or when you came back, but we did have a question a little bit ago is about what exactly do we want to model in relation to this kind of exiting SPP scenario? Because there's a lot of aspects that go into that play. Looking for a little bit more of that insight, and Kathy kind of highlighted a little bit of the discussion I think we had. Maybe you weren't on. So I just want to circle back on that is to get your insights on, from a stakeholder perspective, what would you be looking for out of this IRP process for us to look into on that? I get your general statements here, and I understand where you're coming from on it. What can we do as part of the stakeholder process here and part of our modeling that you're looking for from the IRP?
Well, I guess like you said, there'd be stranded assets, just like when the city of Boulder tried to pull out of Excel in Colorado. There's going to be issues with exiting now after you're already in for a number of years. So I guess that whole cost estimate would have to be relayed and somehow shown as a cost moving forward. But yeah, then what would it take for you guys to stand up your own standalone, fully integrated utility without the market? Your own balancing, basically going back to pre-SPP days, what would that take? And then what are the, of course you're going to take an energy hit, but is the problem with the planning reserve margin is, it's area wide, and it may work fine for a northern utility that has a summer peak that's double their winter peak, but you guys have a flat load curve. And so that when they double the winter reserve, it basically means you have to double your planning reserve. And that's very costly. And it's a paperwork cost. That's the frustration of it is we're not really sure if it's absolutely necessary, or if it's because I mean that's not that atypical to have a higher planning reserve in the winter, but it is usually typical that the utility doesn't have a similar winter peak as it does a summer peak. And so it just, I don't know, I think we calculated it was nearly 400 megawatts of excess capacity you need just because of that 38% winter PRM. And that's not cheap. And so I think that's where we need to balance that. If, what would it be without SPP's mandate? If it's still 38%, then I guess that's the end of the conversation. But if it can be something more reasonable, um, and then the whole ELCC question is because that's really what's the driver. It's not so much the 38%, it's the ELCC of, when you're putting in batteries and it's worth 50 or 37% in the winter in Roswell, and you have PNM putting one in Albuquerque that's at 80% accreditation. That's a big difference. And Roswell and Albuquerque is not that far apart. So a better understanding of why a battery gets credited so much higher 200 miles west would be helpful.
Okay, appreciate the insights. I think it's definitely going to be a big challenge for us to do a full analysis of leaving SPP as part of this IRP, but we can pull in some of these topics and threads that you outlined here, and we can see how we can bring some of that back as part of the process. Thanks, Darren, for your insights into your previous comments.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Darren. I see one hand, Michael Palm, and we are going to head into break here shortly. So, Michael, we'll have you be our last question, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm just curious, when we start talking about planning reserve margins and how they've increased, dramatically over time. From y'all's experience, would you say that as the amount of a renewable generation has increased across the RTO, the PRM has also increased? I mean, we have to deal with the fact that you've got less reliable generation. I think back whenever the generation stack was basically all dispatchable, you didn't need to have as much reserves, right? When we start talking about winter reserves, and when you increase solar, generation has a capacity factor of like 20% maybe in the winter, right? So would you say that's one of the main reasons?
So what I'll provide just my understanding, and I'm not in the weeds of exactly how the LOLE study is fully analyzed and how it balances the different resources. But what I can say is that when SPP was developing the 2029 and winter 2029, 2030 calculations, there was an initial run that had higher planning reserve margin requirements. And then stakeholders pushed for more forecasted thermal generation to be utilized in the analysis, and then the value came down. I don't know where there's maybe a crossing point where that isn't valid, or exactly how the different resources are utilized and how they truly drive the outcome. But what I can say is during those stakeholder meetings, when utilities pushed for inclusion of more thermal resources into the forecasted period, the planning reserve margin did decrease. And that is a key topic that the Southwest Power Pool keeps bringing up is, are these thermal resources actually going to happen? And so that's been the follow-up after that of stakeholders push for more thermal resources. Now SPP is asking, are those thermal resources actually going to make it onto the system, or do we overcompensate with thermal resources? So broadly, I think your comment appears to be generally correct, that more thermal resources can drive down the PRM. But again, I don't exactly know where that maybe is then disproven as part of the methodology.
Okay,
Okay.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And I am out of note-taking space and we are out of time. So really appreciate everybody's thoughts here. This is really, again, to lay the foundation to get you all ready as SPS presents their base case in the coming weeks, and then you all respond with stakeholder modeling requests. So we will take these notes back. We're going to include them in the summaries. There's several follow-up items that we will bring back around and help SPS as they think of their topics for the oncoming future workshops. And we will adjourn for about 15 minutes for a break, and then we're going to meet back in the main room. Today is the day we're going to hear on the data sharing. I misspoke last time with this group yesterday, but Linda will return here to talk through what the data sharing will look like, so that those of you who are modelers and want to get into those files, you know how to have access. So we will be back at 10:30 Mountain Time, joining the main room, and we'll see you in not quite 15 minutes. Thank you, folks, and thank you to the SPS team for
Thank you.
the questions.
Thank you.
On as well as those here in the room in Roswell. What we'd like to do now is ask you to reflect on what you've learned yesterday and today. So we're going to give you a few minutes to think about what are your main takeaways, what were you surprised by, and most importantly, where do you still have questions or want to learn more? That will give us some guidance as to what to focus on in follow-ups and in future workshops, just like your interest information. We really want to hear from you. And because we have this amazing resource in the SPS team that's here today, we'll also dig into if any of those questions you want to try to have answered here today while you're in the room, we'll have time for that. So any questions we don't have time for, we'll ask you to either put in chat if you're on Zoom, or put on a 3x5 card on your table so we can follow up with that. But right now we're going to really, let's give everyone about 5 minutes to get your thoughts together on these questions here before we hear back from you. And then when we come back together here in 5 minutes, Kathy will keep track of specifically what questions you have and where you want to learn more. So please go ahead and just reflect. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to think about what you've heard and where you want to learn more, what questions you have. Let's start with those here in the Roswell room. Stakeholders, are there topics that we didn't cover in these past 2 days that you want to hear more about? Are there topics that you really want to explore into more detail? So Kevin, you look like you have one on your card. You'd like to start?
I think my main takeaway was just the size, the reach of the Southwest Power Pool. I remarked to everybody that it's amazing how much of the Southwest Power Pool is to the northeast of us. And I grew up in Montana, and I never considered that I would be part of anything called the Southwest Power Pool.
Yeah. So for those on Zoom, Kevin's reflecting that how the Southwest Power Pool is extensive and it's a big deal. I never thought living in Roswell he would be a part of something that extended all the way up to Montana. So the influence, the impact. What else, Kevin?
And then one of my other questions, we discussed it earlier, just the implications of leaving a power pool. Like, is there a point where the benefits can outweigh the long-term obligations?
Yeah, Kevin's other observation is that what's the trade-off, but cost benefit and benefits of staying with or leaving the Southwest Power Pool. So cost and benefits question.
It's quite amazing.
Yeah, it's quite a
decades. Then you have no benefit.
right.
Like you still have.
Yeah, Kevin is reflecting that you have a cost there to leave. There's a bill even after you leave, if you live.
It's an analysis that, you know, it's like a year-long analysis. It's not something you can figure out matter.
And Linda Hudgens from SPS is adding that this is not a simple analysis to do. It takes some time, and just because you leave one RTO SPP, you have to join one other and create another one, right? There's a significant implication. Yeah, I will come back to that in a second, Kevin. Let's be sure. Carol, we see your hand up. We'll come back to you. Is there anybody else in the room that's got a reflection, question? Kevin, is there something you want to learn more about in that topic? The cost benefit of the potential of. Okay, it's one. Great. What else? Jason. Jason's reflecting. He's got a lot of homework to do, but hopefully this gave you some information to complete that homework. Great, good, okay. Andrew.
Well, I would just say I have an appreciation for the different constraints between requirements set through SPP, requirements set through commission, and then also the difference between the IRP and the RF. So just appreciate all of those constraints that you have that feed into this process.
So Andrew is reflecting, he appreciates the constraints that are in place regarding the utilities future, and appreciates also the idea that it's the latter part what you said was, remind me again.
The difference between
the difference. Yeah, the striking difference between IRP planning and RFP evaluation, even though some analysis tools are used in both, they're different, right? And they have different purposes. And so that understanding those differences is important. Great. Ransom, yes.
I would say something that made an impression on me was the explosion in requests that have happened the last couple of years, and what those implications are as far as costs for build out to support that and the balance of meeting the need versus incurring the cost is a significant challenge.
Yeah, Ransom is reflecting that the enormity of the requests that are in front for new interconnection or load growth connections, and then the cost implications that would result from being able to support all of those. It's not insignificant. And in a timely fashion, because businesses need to operate at speed. All right, great, thank you. Let's see, I think Kara, did you have let's go to the Zoom room for reflections and questions where you want to learn more. Kara, I don't see her hand up anymore. Am I just missing it on my screen?
I
okay.
dropped it.
Oh, go ahead, Kara.
Yeah, there are a lot of takeaways, but the main one would be what I learned about demand response and consideration of VPPs on SPS's
Kara, are you
system?
speaking?
Maybe drop it in the chat if we're not hearing you in the room.
Kara,
Can you hear me
try
now?
again? Yes.
There we go.
Okay. I was just saying the main takeaway is the way that demand response and virtual power plants are treated on SPS's system. And it led me to learning a little bit more about VPPs on my own. And so I look forward to furthering those conversations through this process of where SPS could model DR and VPP a bit more robustly, and what are its limitations.
Great, thank you. I'm sure we'll have more conversation about that, so we'll put that on the list. Other reflections from folks in the Zoom room or questions, places you want us to dig into more detail? Yes, I see Darren. Go ahead, Darren.
Thanks, Margie. Yeah, I just wanted to, I didn't get a chance late yesterday to discuss in the resource piece. And actually, I think staff will be following up with some information requests later. But we're very aware of what's going on in other Excel territories. And we just wanted to make sure that SPS was looking at resources that have been tried and true in their sister facility, sister entities. We haven't heard much about nuclear power, a little bit about advanced nuclear power, but Xcel Energy operates two nuclear power plants, and I'm not sure that's an option, given the water issues at Tolk. But if that is not an option, then we should at least have that highlighted somewhere, because that's a pretty big deficit to not have that as a potential option for baseload generation. And then Colorado has had a pumped hydro facility for many years, 60 years. And so I just wanted to know what are the possibilities for long duration storage. And then going back up to Minnesota, Google has talked about a contract with Northern States Power for their data center powered by wind, solar, and a 100-hour iron air battery. So just want to make sure we're putting all the options out there that their sister utilities are looking at.
Great. Darren, I think we may have time for an SPS person to respond to that once we get through people with their hands up. If it maybe Justin or Jared want to speak to Darren's inquiry about these other resources available. So let me give you time to think about that while we go to Mark with your observation and question.
Yeah, just briefly, I really thought the discussion we had on load forecasting and what John and Travis talked about, and including the different buckets that you have, a little more detail in those things, and also the distinction of sustainability. It isn't, and I think presenting that in the IRP, I think is helpful. I mean, it'll be super helpful in the next CCN, but I think that level of detail and explanation was very important to understand what the goal is, and that's what my client's very concerned about is. And I think and I like to spend less time, on having to defend the fact that the slow growth is real. So anyway, I just want to commend that. So my takeaway is I think that's really great. And I also encourage SPS to continue to utilize those SPP levers that are available. And we talked about most of them. There may be some others that I tried to go back to my notes to find some others. And the last thing, and I didn't get a chance to ask about, but I think it was Senate Bill or House Bill 93 and these microgrid options. I know it's a little bit further out if they're and it may not be something you can talk about publicly because those are kind of customer specific, but to the degree you could share if that's becoming a meaningful part of the resource overall picture, that would be interesting to know. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Anybody else on Zoom want to speak up about questions or where you want to learn more or takeaways? Anything else? Okay. So Jared, how about your team want to tackle a couple or Justin, a question? I'm going to ask you to come up here so folks can hear you. You want to talk a little bit about Darren's question on resources that he mentioned and how they fit into the puzzle or not?
Thank you. So on the 2 pages that we provided on the resource specific one, we do have a sheet of both of our traditional generic resources and also our emerging tech that we're reviewing. So we do have generic pricing information for all of those components. We're still developing our thermal generation generic resource pricing, but we do have pricing information, and those resources that we're listing out are ones we are expecting to make available in the model. So the model will be able to select those resources. It may very well be, though, that those resources are just not cost effective and they may not show up in a least cost scenario. I think that if there's some specific types of scenarios where folks want to see, an explicit impact, like on the cost differential between portfolios against our base plans that we build out, we'll look at specific technology. And Darren, I think you mentioned the AP 1000. You're right. Like there's a lot of limitations around water supply across SPS's territory, but definitely specifically in the Tolka area. But if we're wanting to understand at least what the model is showing as like a cost differential to implement those technologies, I think that that's something that we could definitely do. So we look to see some sensitivities being requested from stakeholders on exactly those emerging techs that we're listing, and say, like, if these aren't selected, we would like to understand what an SMR looks like, or in 2035, or when your earliest expectation that technology could be bid into an RFP or something like that. But there are of all the information we're providing, there are thousands of permutations that could be developed. The least cost scenario will have some general assumptions, but if you're wanting to see very specific impacts on the cost of the portfolios, we ask that you please provide us those scenarios. So, okay. Darren, did that get your question, or is there more to it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I just wanted to throw that out. I mean, yeah, that's another observation we've had, or I've had, really, is that the only AP 1000 units that have been built are in non-RTO. It's in a non-RTO area, and I'm wondering if there's any connection with that. Because SPP does throw these curveballs that make you guys buy things on the short term, and you're not going to build an AP 1000 on a short cycle. And I just wonder how Georgia did that. Because I'm not seeing a clear pathway to actually doing something that takes 15 years to construct.
Yeah, I hear you. And I also think that, the IRP process, when we would be able to see our expectation of when that resources would come in. So, we're having a 20-year planning horizon. Do we expect it to come in 15 years from now or at the very tail end? Or, some of those different assumptions I think are important for us to have in the IRP. Generally, the RFP, when we're looking at a near-term procurement for a statement of need that's within the next 5 years, um, that's also a limitation. If you're looking at a resource that takes 15 years to develop, how will you ever get it selected in a portfolio in the next 5 year or 3 year uh, uh, capacity need period that we identify? And also, if you're making a selection of resources based upon the least cost portfolio, making an investment in a resource that far out into the future inherently has some challenges with understanding its cost impact to the portfolio. So, love to further the conversation though. I would, Darren, if you've got some specific scenarios that you're thinking about, I would love to hear them through the any of your requests you may have.
Yep. Yeah, no, I don't have an easy answer. I mean, I was involved in the Monticello power uprate, and that took multiple outages, over a decade or more just to bring out another 70 megawatts out of that facility. So I'm not sure how these long-term projects get approved and cost recovery and all of that, but that's where I'm just concerned that we're not thinking big enough to meet our challenges, and I just want to make sure we're not constrained through our IRP or our RFP process to not look at those options. And
I think that's some very good feedback, and we welcome that feedback, and that's something that we can incorporate into the IRP report.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Justin, and thanks for the questions and discussion, Darren. Is there any other topic that came up here in these reflections that the SPS team wants to respond to? Kathy, is there anything in there that looks like it'd be good for the whole group to hear at this point?
Pretty quiet.
Okay. Okay. Well, then let's shift to the last piece of the program, which is Linda Hudgens from SPS talking about what might be useful tools for you all in accessing information as we move forward. So Linda. Thank you. Your slides.
So we're going to look at some examples of forms that we'll have posted on the GridWorks website as well as our website. You may not all be interested in actually getting into the modeling details, but we have a way to share files with those of you that do. We have what we call Encompass input files and output files, and that way you can see the assumptions that are being used for the modeling that Justin's team does, and then the output after it's gone through the modeling runs. We will reach a point. Can you go on to the next slide, please? We'll reach a point as we go through the summer of getting stakeholder requested runs where we will run models based on specific inputs and assumptions that the stakeholders would like to see. Maybe you're on the very last slide. I think that may be the very last slide of the deck. Yeah, there we go. There you go. Okay. Sorry. So if you, okay, there we go. Go down one, please. Okay, so this is just the high level. So we use a file share system because these are really big files. And so we use an iManage file share system, and I'll show you some example forms here in a minute that we will post to the GridWorks site. Once
someone does get access, there's a system generated email that would come to you that gives you general directions of how to get in there. We'll also post an iManage user guide on the GridWorks site as well as ours, just to help you navigate that. Now, we have filed a protective order at the commission. We haven't received the order on it yet, but basically that is giving us a way to share confidential data with folks. And so before you gain access to the files, we would ask you to sign and return a confidentiality agreement. I have an example in here that you'll see, but I'll update it once we get that final order from the commission with the language that they see fit. We just want to make sure that it's a legalese thing, make sure that we have everything in compliance with it in the final order. And then there is my email address that will also be on these forms that you can download from the GridWorks or our website. So happy for you to take it down now, or you can always access it from that website as well. I may not be able to answer the question, excuse me, but I know how to get to the person that can answer the question with any technology things. So let's go on to the next slide. So this as an example of what the form will look like. Very simple. Just wanted to show you a picture of what you can expect when you go on to download that. If you want to go on to the next form. So that's an example of the confidentiality agreement that I was saying. I'll get that language updated from the protective order, and so it may look slightly different, a word or two, whenever you download that. That's what we would have you sign and return before accessing any of the confidential input-output files. And is there one more slide? Okay, so this is a very small snippet of the user guide, just so you would have an idea of what it would look like. And we would have that available for you to download to help you navigate to the files. And then, of course, like I say, my email address will be on there. So if you have any problems, you can contact me and I'll put you in touch with the techies that know how to help. So that's really all I have. Are there any questions about file sharing of input-output files? Sometimes you'll hear people call them Encompass IO files. Any questions on that? I'll see if there's any hands raised. I don't see any hands raised online either. Okay. I think that's pretty much all I have. And, you know, like I say, we'll answer any questions as we get to that point as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Are there any questions for Linda on the Zoom? I want to give a chance for people to raise their hand and ask questions if you have them of Linda on the information sharing. Okay, great. Obviously, there's a trade-off between how much information comes to these workshops and how much is detail that will be of interest to you through this iManage system. And so we'll try to strike a balance between those and bring information that stakeholders need to go to the next step in our process, which will be to define stakeholder requested modeling runs. But we know there are some folks who want to dig deep into the details. And so that's our mechanism for giving you detailed modeling information access. So thank you for the SPS team putting together a process that will accommodate some deeper digging into details. Thank you, Linda. So thank you all for sticking in. We wanted to preview what's going to be happening next in our workshop series. And so this is a slide I referred to yesterday when someone asked the question about what topics will be covered in the future. And so you recall we mentioned 3 phases. We're starting now with building a foundation of knowledge, understanding what your interests are, getting acquainted with the SPS system. And so we have a workshop number 3 scheduled on April 30th from 9 to 12 Mountain Time. It will be virtually supported, and the focus will be at that point on the modeling foundation. What are the utilities' plans for doing modeling? What's the framework? What kind of scenarios and sensitivities are they thinking of running? And we'll engage a conversation with stakeholders about any of your thoughts, though we won't have to wrap up that conversation until we get into more detail in the May, June, July timeframe. But we want to start the thinking at workshop number 3 so that stakeholders are thinking about what additional scenarios or sensitivities you are interested in. So that will be workshop 3. We have the dates, but we don't yet have times for the May through September workshops, but those dates are set. We are continuing to consider how to accommodate both people in person and on Zoom. So if you have any thoughts or preferences regarding that, please let us know. We'll do our best to accommodate interests and availabilities. We understand travel can be a constraint for many people, but we want to make that option available, especially for some of the key conversations. So we'll be disclosing more information and detail about these times, but you can count on April 30th, 9 a.m. to 12 via Zoom. And our focus will be on more information about the modeling framework, foundation, inputs, assumptions, and we might have more detail at that point about the information access protocols. If we have the protective order in place at that time, there'll be ability to fill out that form and request access to iManage through the SPS team. So with that, I would just like to thank you all for being here in person, and thank you to the Zoom folks for hanging in there for what was probably a fairly long duration on Zoom. But we will be posting a written summary of this workshop on our GridWorks website. If you have additional questions, both Linda and Deb Shields, our colleague, will be happy to take your questions and factor them into our planning. I already talked about the next workshop via Zoom. And with that, I would like to see if there are any stakeholder questions or comments before I turn the microphone over to Jared for final closing remarks from SPS. So first, are there questions of anybody here in Roswell or on Zoom? We have a worn out group, but or hungry or something. So Jared, let me turn it over to you for final remarks from our utility hosts.
Thank you, Margie. I'll keep this brief. Just wanted to thank everybody for the participation over the last 2 days. Definitely want to thank GridWorks for facilitating this meeting, both in the hybrid environment and then just for taking care of us here in the room. For those of you who made it to Roswell, appreciate. I hope you guys enjoy your stay here in Roswell and seeing kind of a stark difference, maybe from Roswell to other parts of maybe where you're from originally. So, but it's one of the good things. Roswell's full of great people. We appreciate the Daniels Center for hosting us. We look forward to everybody who has participated thus far in the first 2 workshops and continuing through. We have pages and pages of notes that have been taken over the last 2 days. A lot of great comments that we'll be working to follow up on and incorporating into this. As Zoe talked about yesterday, the whole point of this is to collaborate with the stakeholders. Really appreciated Commissioner Nybert's comments today. This is the whole point, is to hear from everybody and then craft the kind of where we want to be going, both from a stakeholder perspective and the utility perspective, and trying to find that balance. We understand that there's a lot of views, depending on where you're at in this industry, whether you're a ratepayer, whether you're a load, whether you're an advocate. There's lots of different views. And at the end of the day, what we want to do is provide a pathway for reliable and affordable energy on our systems and keep the lights on and take care of the needs of customers. And finding that balance is always challenging, but appreciate everybody's insights and feedback as we will craft eventually at the end of this, the statement of need, and then kind of providing that pathway for us for future RFPs and engagements with the commission and stakeholders down the road. So I guess just appreciate everybody for taking the time out for this one. Look forward to seeing everybody at workshop number 3 and we'll be in touch about the future hybrid type meetings and see how we can continue to facilitate that type of a dynamic with the stakeholders. So thank you all. And is that it? All right. And that's all. Thank you, everybody.